that I really got into before I started gardening because of the environmental impact. So we're just going over bare basics. If there's any questions, I can take them at the end. I'm not an expert, but I'd be happy to try and find sources for you if you could. So basically, composting is just the act of biological decomposition of organic matter. There's a lot of different reasons why people compost. Most of us as gardeners are composting to increase our soil tilth. It also helps to improve the water retention in the soil, which means less watering for us. It helps to prevent erosion. It can also help roots to have kind of a better hold in the soil, especially if you have compacted soil. And it reduces waste both in the landfills from food and also from different types of material, things like cardboard, newspapers that would normally be thrown away. This was just kind of a short informational on the amount of things in our trash that could actually be composted instead. So about half of the trash that the US throws away could actually be thrown in the compost bin. Most of that comes from food scraps, which is, hopefully it's scraps. A lot of it might even be wasted food, but the rest comes from a lot of paper materials, especially newspapers that could be composted, and cardboard. So the bare bones of composting is you need a carbon source, a nitrogen source, you need water, oxygen, and the microorganisms. Most of the time the microorganisms are already in the material that we're putting in the compost bin, so they're already on the peels that you're throwing in, they're already on the eggshells, they're already on the newspapers, so it's not always necessary to add a compost starter to that. You should have the materials that you already need. So these are a few different kind of examples of bins that you can use. You can get really super fancy bins, or you can go very low tech and they can be DIY, kind of like this guy up here with the trash barrel. The main thing is that there needs to be some ventilation, so there need to be holes for air. You can also get some of the commercial brands like the tumbler, which the advantage to that is you are going to compost faster because you're going to be mixing the air, the water, it's easier to turn. Or you can do some of the older methods like just the wire bins, or my favorite is just a heap because it's just really easy to turn. You don't have to dig in there to turn any of the compost. This is actually my newest compost container from home. This is a vermicompost bin, so it's actually a worm bin used to decompose, and one of the advantages to that is it just decomposes a lot faster than you would if you're just leaving it outside. So how it works is you need a certain ratio of carbon to nitrogen for the chemical reactions to occur. And if you kind of shred your leaves or shred your scraps, they're actually going to break down a lot faster than if you just leave them in whole form. You also need sufficient moisture because the little microorganisms in there actually need the moisture to live. And you need oxygen. And oxygen can be added by simply just turning your compost. So the microorganisms, when they start to break down the food and the material in the compost, actually generate heat. So your compost pile, even during the winter, is going to generate a little bit of heat, and it can be anywhere between 90 to 140 degrees. There are, larger compost piles that actually generate quite a bit of heat, and you have to be careful because they can actually combust. So carbon sources, you want about 30 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Carbon sources can be anything from dried leaves, corn stalks, straw. More household items for, that are probably more common would be newspaper, paper grocery sacks, dryer lint, human or pet hair can actually go in the compost too. And then nitrogen, that's kind of the easy source that we all think of, like our food scraps, our eggshells, manure, so horse, cow, poultry, pig, any of that is fine, and coffee grounds and coffee filters are good for the compost too. There's a lot of stuff though that you don't want to put in your compost for various reasons. Cat and dog feces, so your animal waste contains a lot of pathogens, And the heat of the pile, of the compost pile, is not always enough to kill those pathogens. So if you think about it, if you're throwing that kind of stuff in your compost and then putting it on your plants and then eating your plants, it's probably not a good idea. Citrus is very acidic, so it can actually harm the microorganisms that break down the food. Dairy, meat, and bones and oily food are ones you just want to avoid because they're kind of like the classic smelly compost piles. You're going to get an odor from it, and you're also more likely to attract stuff that you don't want, like raccoons, rodents, possums, all kinds of things. Weeds and weed seeds and also diseased plants are again no-nos for the compost. Even though you think you clean up all your yard brush, you throw it in the heap, you don't want to do that because it doesn't get hot enough where it's going to kill those pathogens. And so the problem that can happen is you throw all those weeds in, compost breaks down, you go and you put it in your beds, and all of a sudden you got weeds shooting up everywhere, or you've got plant diseases that are spreading because you actually didn't kill any of those pathogens or seeds. And then lime is not something you typically want to put in the compost because the pH or the acidity of it, it's so basic that it actually, you really want your compost between 4.2 to 7.2 pH, and the lime just makes it too basic, so it's not going to decompose properly. So there's a really great article that you can pull off of the Iowa State Extension website, and it actually is very detailed. I thought about just including it in here because it's in picture format, but your ideal compost bin or compost heap size is 3 by 3 by 3. So if you get any smaller than that, you're not going to have enough stuff to kind of create that chemical reaction. And if it gets bigger than that, you can actually have so much stuff that the pile gets really hot and there's a risk for combustion. So the piles can also be constructed, and these are more like if you have a larger scale operation, you can construct in long rows. And the purpose of that is it makes it a lot easier to turn. You also have to consider moisture because the compost does need some degree of moisture, but if it gets too wet, you're gonna get really, really stinky compost and probably some unhappy neighbors. You also want it in a sunny spot because it needs to be warmed. And in order to help speed up decomposition of the whole pile, you do have to turn it from time to time. Turning adds oxygen, and then the oxygen actually speeds up the chemical decomposition, creates more heat, so things will break down a lot faster. It'll still decompose if you don't turn it, it just takes a lot longer. So some of the common concerns people have with composting, the biggest one I always hear is, doesn't that stink? That's really gross. Honestly, I don't have an odor to our compost pile. We're very, very careful about what we put in it. So we're very cautious not to put any dairy or certain food scraps in it that we know are gonna be smelly or attract rodents. Some of the ways that you can kind of combat that problem are to make sure that you don't have excess moisture or that your compost isn't so compact that it's not able to properly decompose. The ammonia odor that people sometimes get is just too much nitrogen, and the easy fix for that is to add more carbon source. So sawdust, straw, this time of year when you're cleaning up your leaves, you can throw those in the compost pile too. Newspaper, if you work in an office, shredded paper also decomposes fairly well, so most of us have that laying around. If your pile temperature is too small, things aren't gonna break down as quickly. So in order to increase that, you just make a bigger pile. Also make sure you pick the right location. So if you're in a sunny spot, it's gonna heat up a lot more efficiently than it would, say if it's in, on the north side of something where you're not getting the sun part of the day. A high pile temperature again can happen if the pile's too big. If you have too much nitrogen in the pile, that can happen. And the reason we get a little, wiggy about the pile being too hot is because it actually kills those beneficial bacteria. And, there's insects in there too. We don't want to kill them because that's what's actually helping us create the compost. And then another big concern I hear from neighbors a lot is, don't you get rats? Don't you get pests? Really, if you're careful about what you put in your compost, those food scraps, if you're not putting meat in there, you're not putting smelly foods in there, they're not after your apple cores and your banana peels. I've not had an issue. We've been doing this for several years and we've not had an issue with any vermin. You'll get the occasional snake in the winter or fall months because it actually is warm, so they like to hide under there once in a while. You'll get a little gardener snake, but nothing too crazy. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about vermicomposting because that's something that we've gotten into in the last year. During the winter, typically your compost is not going to break down outside as quickly just because temperatures are colder. Everything freezes, so you have that whole piece of time where it's like, okay, what do you do with your kitchen scraps? So this year, as a family, we decided we were gonna get worms and keep them in the house. And it seems kind of weird. People think it's kind of iffy, but actually, like, we really haven't. It hasn't changed life for us at all. So it's a little bit more expensive than traditional composting just because you need some materials, but it can be done as cheaply as just getting like an old Tupperware container, drilling some holes in the side and putting your materials in. It's a little trickier when you get done because you gotta sift through and take your worms out, but that would be a cheap way. We did buy a commercial bin because you do need to have some drainage with it. They do make waste material, so, and that's not healthy for them to sit in. It's very similar as to what you would put in your compost bin outside. So you're going to need bedding material, which is mainly your carbon source. So dryer lint's good, newspaper's great. I heard mixed reviews on office paper. I do use shredded office paper and they seem to decompose it just fine. And we have healthy worms. So kitchen scraps are a must, but again, same principles as what you're gonna do with outside. You don't wanna put bones in there. You don't wanna put citrus in there. It's too acidic, it's going to kill your worms. Most of the worms can be bought commercially. So there's actually, I think it was like Uncle Jim's worms. We got them off of Amazon. So they come in a big container. They're kind of puny, but they actually do grow and they procreate. So if you manage properly, you can actually get free worms from your worm bin. Red wigglers are the most common type, and I brought a few with some finished product if anybody wants to see what it looks like when it gets finished. And then, like, as far as smell goes, if you're maintaining your bin properly, there's really no odor to it. So my kids absolutely love it. They love going in and throwing the scraps in and looking for the worms. But if you are noticing an odor, it's usually because you're feeding them too much. 500 worms, they say, can decompose about half a pound of food per week. So we have no problem keeping them fed. So some of the benefits of vermicompost or composting with worms versus traditional compost is it's actually the worm casings that you get from it, the end product, actually has a lot more nitrogen in it, and so it works better as a fertilizer than the regular compost. It's really neat if you want to teach your kids about like biology or anything like that. Like one of the cool things that we learned as we were setting this up is that worms are hermaphrodites, so they have both parts to procreate on their own, and as long as they have food in the bin, they will kind of replicate in response to the food. If you give them more food, you're gonna get more worms. If they run out of food, their reproduction slows down. So it was just kind of cool stuff we learned. And then one of the things that I started using on my house plants too is worm tea. And it's kind of like you make your own tea. So you get the worm castings and you put it in like a cheesecloth or an old t-shirt or something, soak it in a bin of water, leave it for 24 hours, take the t-shirt out, and it's kind of like this big soupy mix. But it is a really, really good fertilizer, and it actually, one of the things that's cool about it, and I'm gonna try it this summer, is it repels aphids and any sucking or chewing insects. So they said it's good for whiteflies. If you got tomatoes or you're trying to keep away whiteflies, that might be a good organic solution for pest control. And then also, vermicomposting helps to improve soil aeration and tilth, which we always want when we're working in our garden. These are just some of the sources I used. The Backyard Worm Bins was actually a really entertaining book. So I would highly suggest that one. It was very detailed. It goes over pest management and everything. And then a lot of information is there on the Iowa State Extension website too. There's actually not as much as I thought there would be, but there are a few articles on getting started. That's all I got for you guys. Questions?
Where did you get your, you said you bought a commercial?
Yeah, Amazon. Amazon had them. There were several. Gardens Alive had the same ones. I'm trying to think back. There was one that was on Gardens Alive. I get way too many gardening catalogs. So this green one here was actually on Gardens Alive, and that's more of it's a worm composting bin that is meant for indoors. But I mean, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. The main thing with vermicomposting is to make sure in the bottom that there's drainage, because if they sit in that excess, it's basically their waste product, it's worm pee, it will kill them. So this one's the one I have, and it works really slick. So as the worms kind of break things down, you just add another bin, and there's holes in the bottom of the bin, so the dirt falls out or the castings fall out and the worms stay on top. It's a lot easier to separate them. If you do something just like a Tupperware container, you kind of manually have to take the worms out.
And where do you keep them?
In the basement. I just, they don't like light at all. So the first couple of days that we got them was they were going all over the place. We kept a lamp on top, and then they don't like the light, so they stay in the box. We haven't had a problem with them scurrying out or anything. We just keep them fed and they're happy.
So I tried the Tupperware version, the Rubbermaid tub.
How'd it work?
Well, they all tried to climb out. And
put a light source on the top.
Okay,
Put a lamp, because that was like one of the things in the worm bin book that I was reading, is that they don't like movement. So when you move them, they kind of get all discombobulated, and they hate the light. So if you leave a light source on top for the first few days until they settle, it helps them to kind of stay in the bin, because they're averse to it.
They were just all dried to our basement floor.
No. we had like one or two casualties, but for the most part, they all stayed where they were supposed to stay. It was good. And they're all still there, and they do replicate, so we've gotten quite a few more.
How warm does it need to be where you keep it?
So that's a really good question. You can't leave it outside all year. It has to be, they do not like it any lower than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And they don't like it super hot either. So if they're outside, it's 40 to 70 is their ideal temp.
So the
basement's a good spot for them. Yeah, and then it's typically dark down there. Like I said, if you're worried about them escaping, we just had a lamp, like a floor lamp over them for a few days, and then they stay in the box. As long as you feed them, they're happy and they stay where they're supposed to stay. So, but it really has, like, as far as like, I just used it with houseplants obviously over the winter. It's really helped my houseplants. So I don't have those little, I don't know what they are, the little gnats anymore.
Fungus gnats.
Yeah, those are horrible. Those are gone now. So that, it really did help.
Kate, do you put eggshells in your compost? Because I've read, maybe it was a different presentation, that if you do compost eggshells, you take out that inner membrane, especially if you're doing it outside.
If you're doing it outside, yeah. So I still put my eggshells in. I usually crush them really fine though, because otherwise they take forever to decompose. And I haven't had an issue with it. So we're in the city, so I'm like, okay, I don't want to piss any neighbors off. But we haven't had any issues other than snakes come when it's warm. That's it.
So what do you do in the winter time? Can you compost in the winter? Or
we still have a pile outside. It doesn't decompose as quickly, so we usually empty the bin. We're in the habit of emptying it in the fall. After we pull everything or most of our stuff out, we'll put a layer of compost down, and then in the spring it's pretty sluggish, but throughout the summer we try and keep up with it too. But it really does slow down. That's why we did the worms this year during the winter, because it slowed down so much during the winter.
I've got one of the drum kind of composter things.
I don't like
And
these.
the first year I used it, I did it right, and it was marvelous.
Right.
It was marvelous. And then the second year, I wasn't quite as good about layering and paying attention to moisture versus
Right.
water. And then I took it out of the homestead because they were doing a composting thing out there and I never brought it back. But I'm thinking I'm gonna bring it back home and put it in the basement.
You
So
could do that.
Cause then I could compost in the winter.
Yeah, because I was always worried about the smell, but really if you're putting the right stuff in it,
Yeah.
you don't get a
Well, I
smell.
never had a problem with
No.
smell, but
No.
it just wasn't processing things correctly.
Yeah, honestly, we started with like a commercial bin and it would open at the bottom, and I've just gone to putting it on the ground because it's so much easier to turn rather than like going in and try and scoop and turning in a bin. Just having it on the ground and being able to flip it over is so much easier.
See, my granddaughter tells me why she just didn't.
She'd spin it, yeah.
Well,
So, but like if you're in the city and on a smaller scale, that's perfect to have. You can keep that out on the deck and you don't have to worry about it. It's probably not gonna keep up with the amount of food scraps you have, but at least I guess some is better than nothing. It doesn't have to be all or nothing as far as like your impact on your garden, on the environment, so.